Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We're glad to have you all here. One thing I've been thinking about over the last couple weeks as we record this is when we did the HERS conference, which if you haven't seen any of that content yet, it should be out in our feed. So please definitely go look for it at this point. A lot of really good conversations we had at that conference. But one of the things we did was a risk summit. So something that you do as a compliance officer with your customers, with your clients around understanding risk. So maybe give us a quick synopsis of what that was and how that went.
Yeah. So when we talk about building out like a risk register and building out a risk management framework, for me, it's the most helpful when you actually bring the leaders into the room and actually explain to them of what their individual risk tolerance is going to look like and actually highlight and go through different risks so that they can understand how the risk scoring process works and that everybody's kind of on the same page. So we did that at the HERS conference where we really wanted to do like a risk summit. And so we talked about the ISO 31000 framework and we walked through risk management and how you assess and treat risk. And then we went through, I believe, 5 different risk scenarios where we actually kind of brought in subject matter experts to talk about risk at a high level and really go through how would we go about kind of like treating and scoring those risks. So it was an interactive experience. The goal is really to like educate and also, again, kind of bring to life something beyond just what a risk register is becoming in a lot of GRC tools, which is just like a fancy spreadsheet. And so it's a lot about actually bringing out the conversation around risk and trying to actually have a thorough conversation about how you would actually handle these things. And so the goal was for it to be an interactive work session so that we could actually like go through these things together and really like figure out how we can actually like shape a risk register around those things. So the goal again is really to just like talk about a risk and then build out the treatment plan together in a more interactive scenario.
Yeah, and it was really enlightening for me. I've never actually gone through that kind of a risk assessment situation before. And if you want to go back and look at those videos, you'll see how uncomfortable I was and not knowing what you really wanted out of me from those things. But it did get me thinking since then, over the last couple of weeks, how similar that is to other tabletop exercises that I've heard about or done myself. Of course, in IT, what I used to do is, and not as a formal kind of a thing, but I would oftentimes sit down with customers as I was working with them to design a data center or whatever that might be, and just look at them and be like, okay, so we've designed this data center. What happens if, the sprinklers go off? Have you thought about not using water sprinklers and instead using one of these other like non-toxic, non-equipment destroying, like they interact with electricity a lot better? Or what if a tornado came through and took out part of your data center or all of your data center? How would you deal with that? And just kind of throwing out potential scenarios at them as to what might happen and how they would react to those things is very similar to what we talked about, which is, hey, what if A happened? What if B happened? I didn't really go through that scoring mechanism that you walked us through. But I know you've gone through some of those exercises as well from a DR type planning perspective. So I don't know, maybe any other parallels that you would draw there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important is the fact that when you're going through a scenario-based exercise is that you do have a true like prompt that you're going to go through and that the team is like aware of what you're actually doing. But then I think also just coming up with sounds like kind of what you were explaining is some of the like worst case scenarios, right? Like this is the worst thing that might happen and kind of highlighting those and building out a framework that supports those as well. I think it's important to make sure that you're highlighting, again, this is what we realistically think is going to happen. And then these are the additional like playbooks that we're going to build out for certain scenarios that we think might happen so we have some better preparedness. Because ultimately the goal for all of these exercises is to come up with some type of plan that the team can execute on, again, when something happens, not necessarily if, but it's when something happens. So building out this framework that the team feels like they're like, okay, in this scenario, we would bring these people in the room and we know we have to start by, securing these particular systems and going from there, I think is the most important way to approach it generally. And I do think it's one of those things that teams should have different exercises that they're doing on an annual basis so that it's not just the same one over and over
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, and to that end, one of the things I oftentimes think about, not really having been on the customer side since these kind of tabletop exercises became a thing, is how often do you do this, and how many different permutations do you focus on? Like, there's a point of diminishing returns at some point where you say, there's 1,000 different scenarios that we could cover. There's, within each of those, there's probably variations of those. Are we going to go through every single one of those scenarios and figure out what we were going to do? Are we going to document, whether the tornado comes from the north versus whether it comes from the west, whether it comes through my house, whether it goes through your house? What is the point of diminishing returns that you found on a situation like that?
Again, I think for the most part, I think if you've had it highlighted in like one scenario, I don't think you necessarily need to like think about northeast west for a tornado hitting your data center. But I think it's important to just have different scenarios that are coming up that still feel really real to the team. That feels like things that are actually likely that could happen. And again, making sure that these are written out in a way that's understandable in the future, as well as like, especially if somebody's not there for whatever reason,
Yeah.
that they can still like pick up and understand what role that team is supposed to function as, I think is really important. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily like not every single scenario needs to be defined.
Yeah. I mean, you spend all your time planning for scenarios for failure rather than actually building the environment itself. Um, Another parallel that we see a lot of is cyber attacks. And what do you do in a cyber attack? And there's a lot of nuances to that one, obviously, because it can be much more intense than a disaster recovery, much more intense than an audit, because the system's down. Like, people aren't able to work. Um, so it becomes a situation where the pressures are higher. There's a lot more going on. Um, in the fact that the less you have to think, the better in all of these scenarios, which is why it's important to document it and to practice it and make it kind of secondhand. But with the cybersecurity incident, it becomes more, the communication aspect of it's even more important, because not only are you trying to recover, but you're also trying to figure out what happened. Um, in a DR scenario, you're starting with, I know what happened. It was a disaster. There was a tornado that came through. There was a flood. There was a fire. We're out of power, whatever that might be, is usually pretty obvious from the beginning. But with a cyber attack, you kind of start right in the middle of the event and you don't even know how it happened, who did it, what even all was affected. Um, and even within the what all was affected, it could be what got exfiltrated. What data did they steal? It could be, did they ransom? Did they encrypt our stuff? Did they delete stuff? So in the heat of that moment, you're in a very unknown state. Whereas with compliance, you kind of know your environment, and they're not tearing it apart. They're just looking for certain things. With DR, you've lost your environment, but you hopefully, as part of that DR exercise, documented everything and mapped it out. It's just a matter of recreating it, and you know where to go to recreate it. When we talk cyber events, how do we deal with those unknowns? How do we figure out how to look both forward and backwards at the same time?
Again, I think a lot of it does have to do with coming up with an actual plan of some type of scenario. Again, unfortunately for that, a lot of it is going to be completely unknown. So it's making sure you do have the right people in the room and can understand exactly how the infrastructure is set up. I do think we have some awareness, right, of like what we think are relatively common attacks. So I do think coming up with a playbook on based off of those kind of common scenarios is like a really good starting point. But unfortunately, a lot of it is like going to be kind of fake it till you make it and figuring it out as you go, which I don't love to give as advice, but unfortunately that's kind of when you're in the scenario, if it's something the team hasn't really thought through before, it's going to be kind of coming up with how you approach it on the ground.
I'm assuming that some part of it is just how do we deal with the unknowns? Like, let's plan to not know. And how are we going to deal with that? Because there's new novel techniques all the time. You can't have a plan that's based on, oh, well, we'll try and close the doors while they're still trying to do stuff, because AI is happening and it's moving so much faster. They're getting so much more damage done in such a much shorter time frame. The dwell time is lower. All these things happen much faster that we don't know how it's going to happen. We've talked about identity before, and the fact that identity is a main vector of attack. People weren't planning for that 5 years ago. And now it's the most common way for them to get in the first place, and they will muck around in there and they will do things to try and create back doors. So how do we plan for those unknown unknowns?
I don't think I have an answer for that.
And there's the big money making idea, apparently. um, so yeah, I mean, it's to me, I would say it's about making sure your team knows how to communicate, knows how to ask questions, and aren't afraid to ask questions or to throw out, "Hey, this weird thing. I just noticed this weird thing. What should we do about that?" And making sure everybody's aware of the fact that that weird thing happened and that they need to pay attention to it, because we've all watched enough movies that are based around mysteries. Like, the smallest little piece of evidence sometimes gets ignored at first, and then later on in the show, they realize, wait a second, that was the key piece of evidence. You just never know what the right piece of evidence is going to be. So being able to plan for not knowing, I think, is an important thing. And yeah, I don't know how you necessarily do that.
But where you work right now, they also do some other types of tabletops exercises. Can you walk us through kind of what those scenarios look like?
Yeah, there's a number of them that we've been working with, and they're mostly based around getting teams to communicate. Oftentimes very similar to regular tabletop exercises. Even within tabletop exercises, you can have ones where we're actually going to, you can go to the extreme of having a second environment where you actually walk through all these things. And then people have to actually do the things that they're going to say that they're going to do. Sometimes, and more commonly, I think, is the one where you all sit around the table and say, okay, well, I'm going to go off and I'm going to go do these things. And it's probably going to take me 4 hours to do this. I'm going to go dig through these log files. I'm going to go run a bunch of queries. I'm going to go investigate. I'm going to go restore. I'm going to do whatever. And then you fast forward and say, okay, 4 hours later, here's where we're at. This is what we found. And you just kind of have to make up stuff. It's a little bit of a D&D game. Like, you don't know where that group is going to go, but I'm going to have them run into this along the way, no matter which direction they go. And then you've got ones that are really just more about question and answers. How would you deal with this? How would you deal with this? Um, did you think about talking to that person? And so what we've developed is a number of different activities that we can either put one company into a room and have a conversation like that around, or we could take at like a community event and say, like a user group type scenario, and say, okay, you're all from different companies around this table. Talk about how your company deals with the communication problem. How are you going to call the people in when you don't have a directory because Teams is down and you can't make calls? And, I would guess apparently now we need to worry about MDM not working, and wiping all of our phones. So we can't even have the contact list on our phone. It's the classic. Sometimes everybody just needs to carry a ream of paper around with them so that they've got the DR plan with them. Um, and really just kind of engaging people to think through these scenarios and have those conversations to understand what would work for this company may not work for this other company, but you can maybe learn from each other some tips and tricks to help out in that scenario. And again, it is all about having the people communicate, having them understand, and in some cases just see the other side's shoes. Like, if I'm a DBA and I'm talking to the security team, and the security team says, okay, well, I would need this information. And they look at me as the DBA, as a database administrator, and how are you going to go about getting that information? I don't know. I should probably figure out how to do that beforehand, so I don't have to figure it out in the heat of the moment. Sometimes that's enough to unlock a pretty big gotcha, especially if you don't have internet access. Like, if they push the red button and shut down the internet so that nothing can go in and out of that organization, at that point, they're going to have to not be able to Google things, not be able to search online for that kind of stuff. So those are, and there's a multitude of different ones, and we're trying out different points in time, for different types of technologies that are getting attacked for specific scenarios. Even getting into some, like, okay, this is a healthcare situation, so the uniqueness of a healthcare where, like, we can't stop doing our job. And one of the challenges that a hospital has during a cyber event is the fact that if they have to run paper in order to move things around, they have to do that, because if I need to take this patient to radiology to get an X-ray taken because I can't do that in the ER, I need some way to communicate that up the chain. up to that second floor, wherever that might be. Thinking through those is really the goal with those, and just kind of helping everybody to understand where the gaps are in the environment. Now, we use those to help them have that conversation, but also to highlight the places where our product can come in and play a role. We don't put our product directly into them at all, though. So there's situations where we want them to ask the question, well, how would we deal with this? And then kind of look at us and be like, is that something you guys do? Is kind of the sneaky way of getting to that conversation. But they're all real world scenarios. We base them on actual customers of ours that have had incidents, whether as a customer or before they were a customer.
Got it. So yeah, it's that using that like tangible, like this thing happened and now let's try to like build a plan around it, I think is a very like potent way to do it, to making sure that you're also just setting up a different path for folks of coming up again with like real scenarios that they can actually sink their teeth in and actually understand like this is exactly how we did this in the past, and coming up with that kind of like path of how they're going to do it next time, I think is hugely advantageous.
Yeah. I mean, one example, they got hit before they were a customer, and it turned into a shouting match on their board. Their board was getting together on a regular basis, and they were chewing out the CIO for what happened, rather than supporting that person and not laying blame in the heat of the moment. Like, that person's team needs to do work and they need to get this stuff done. Instead, they were attacking that person and making that person not want to show up to these calls and informing the board about things, because they're just going to jump on me. Why would I share this information with them? And so just even those interpersonal dynamics can be a big eye opener for those companies.
So then I guess when we're thinking about what are the big ones for organizations to be doing on an annual basis, for me, it's definitely going through your business continuity and disaster recovery plan. I think generally most companies should be doing that at least on an annual basis. I think walking through also like a major security incident and going through the plan for that recovery as well is also really important. And then again, I'm biased. I also think risk management should also have this type of like interactive summit as well, which I call a risk summit for organizations. So those are kind of the big three to me that are like disaster recovery. And then you've got your security incident response as well as in your risk management framework, so that you're testing those three things actively with your community.
Yeah. And not just the technical aspects of it. I mean, it goes all over the place. Like in a cyber incident, one of the things that has to happen is PR. Especially if you're very visible. How are you going to answer the questions the press is going to come at you with when you don't want to share any information? What's the right amount of information to share? How far should you go with it? Who's authorized to have that conversation? How much do you share with customers? How much do you share with your partners? I mean, those are all super non-technical aspects. And it's not like the PR team can just go, okay, well, we're gonna take vacation for the next 2 weeks while you get this thing sorted out. No, they've got a lot. The pressure's on them as well. Like there's no slowing down for anybody in a situation like that.
No. And that's why it is also important to making sure that you have some of the teams that folks might not necessarily think are like that pertinent to those conversations, such as marketing, of making sure that they are in the room, because they are generally the ones that are going to be handling the response and the feedback from the press or external third parties, to making sure that that is handled appropriately and not, overstating certain things or, providing too much information. I think is making sure you have the right leaders in the room for those conversations is really important as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's no lack of examples on, hey, the janitor staff needs to pay attention, because if we have a cyber incident and the doors all get locked, how are we going to deal with that? These are the types of insights you get by just having that conversation sometimes. So yeah, hugely informative. I appreciate you doing that risk summit, because it did get me thinking about it. And there's a lot of things that tie into that same concept of just sit down and talk through the whole thing, and let's decide what we need to. At the end of it, I guess the other aspect that's super important is at the end of it, having a plan. Like, what are we going to improve? How are we going to improve them? Where are the gaps at? And what is the priority? Because you'll come out with more gaps than what you can deal with in 6 months. And if you want to do this every 6 months to test those improvements, you got to be realistic about what improvements you can complete in that time frame.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think a lot of organizations bite off a little bit more than they can chew when they come up with these types of plans where they're like, oh, shoot, we need X, Y, and Z thing. I like what you said of like piecemealing it a little bit together, of understanding like, hey, we have to have a certain amount of things in place, but some of it is going to be ad hoc. And as we're going, unfortunately, that just kind of is the nature of the beast. You really can't prepare for every different type of disaster. So it's coming up with different types of tips and tricks and general communications that are going to help make sure the team is working together in lockstep and not, asking too many questions because they don't know who to go to or, what they should be focusing on. It's like coming up with a relatively streamlined approach that you can then kind of like copy and paste for different scenarios as they continue to come up.
Speaking of communications, one other variable that you and I have both been long-term distributed team players. Does it work to do these types of things as a distributed team, or how important is it to be together, like physically around a table?
I think it's awesome if you can do it when everybody's in the room together. I think there's like a community part of it that makes it easier. I think obviously you can definitely do that virtually as well. I think I've seen that done many times too. But I think there is something to be said about like if this could be something that's tied to like sales kickoff or something that like a particular time of year where most of the team is going to be in person together. I do think it's a good time to do it.
Yeah, and I've seen this at a few security cons. They do the capture the flag type thing, is a common one for practicing the skill sets of threat hunting and things like that. But when it comes time to do kind of more of this tabletop, how do you deal with an incident outside of the technical aspects of it? Doesn't happen commonly, but I have seen it done. It can be interesting when you get a bunch of different companies together to talk about how they do these things and trying to get everybody to learn from one another. I think can be a huge part of the community aspect of things that you would get at like a local security con. Like I said, around a sales kickoff or any sort of team building event, like build in an extra half day to do that kind of tabletop. Again, you don't have to have everybody there for it. Sometimes just as a individual team, knowing where we need to reach out, what are our touch points outside of our team, or even how do we, who's going to take what? We're all server admins. We all can cover each other's servers, but who's going to tackle what? What are the most important, within our own team, we should understand what the most important things are and walk through what the business hopefully is put together and say, if the business needs this, what are we going to do? Well, first we need to go do these other things before we can even start on that one. Oh, has anybody highlighted that to the business because that's going to hurt their recovery time objectives? Those types of conversations can happen within a single team, but obviously are going to quickly result in things they need to reach out to on other teams. But can be a way to get some quick wins to then move into the bigger team.
Have you had the opportunity to kind of be a part of more of those types of tabletop exercises? Obviously, I think you're working a lot with some of the teams that are potentially more in the background than the ones that you're on. So have you kind of had the opportunity to get in the room with those folks?
Not within my own company. I'm not even aware of any that we have done from our own perspective. But it's a big company, and while marketing is an important part of any tabletop exercise and planning for that situation, I probably wouldn't have much of a role in that situation. Um, I have sat in some of the events that we've done and seen what those are like, and kind of walked around and listened to conversations around a table where people are discussing the topics. So those are always interesting to hear and to understand what they're actually looking for, what the different constituencies are looking for. One of those events I actually got to sit down with. There's, I think, 3 or 4 people from one single team that were there, and was able to catch them during a break and just kind of had a conversation about what they were doing, what they were putting together as a team. And they felt pretty comfortable walking out of that exercise just because they had similar tabletop exercises internally. And so they were able to walk in there and be like, yeah, we talked about this piece as a team, and they were able to share that with the other people at the table that were from different companies. And so it's a little bit of that peer insights aspect of thing, and being able to teach other people that maybe don't have the time to think about it because they're a smaller org or they're leaner org or whatever that might be.
I think from a development and education training perspective, though, I think that these types of scenarios that you're doing can actually be a really, really great way to onboard people onto the different processes that you have internally within an organization too. Because I think, again, it requires a certain amount of people that are in the room thinking through the challenges and that are also actually thinking through, like, what would this look like in practice? How are we actually going to work through these issues in the room together as these things are coming up. So I do think it's actually a really great place where you're kind of moving beyond theory and you're actually doing the procedural steps that are involved, which again, I do think usually pulls in a larger crowd. It's not just like the higher ups that are doing these things together, because it's the folks that they would actually need to bring in the room to actually execute on the process. So I think it's a really great opportunity to train folks on different process as well. And then again, highlight gaps to being like, hey, I'm not actually sure how we would handle this particular portion of the puzzle. And, coming up with action plans is like, hey, these are the things we have to solve for because these are unknowns.
Yeah. And making it as real world as possible is obviously a big part of that. Like I said, you could go as far as to have use your DR environment to actually go through the process and go hunting, capture the flag style for something. It's not very repeatable. Like, that takes a lot of work to build that environment to the point where you can do that. So it's not something you could do on a regular basis. But sitting down and actually using the tools, hey, we'll use Slack because it's external to our organization. And you say, okay, well, let's all go log into Slack and we'll look at the channels that we would use and maybe walk everybody together through, okay, put them together as a priority group so that when you log in, it's always there at the top. And things like that. Like, how can we set up our tools to work better for us? I can sit around the table with our laptops open and we can do that right there and then and just knock it out right away. Becomes, it's going to improve the overall effort that you get out of it, the overall advantages that you'd find there. So yeah, there's a lot there. One final piece that I would probably throw out there is there's a really good book called, I think it's the Zero Trust Project, if I remember right. I'll have to go look that up, but I'll put it in the episode notes to make sure we've got the right one there. But it's a really good example of how a company could use a tabletop exercise. It actually shows the process of I think it was a new CIO coming into the organization and saying, hey, how do you guys do things here? Let's walk through these things. Let's bring somebody in external to walk us through a tabletop exercise that highlights, in this case, the zero trust nature of the environment and highlighting how important that is to show that, hey, putting firewalls within our own IT environment, not firewalls as we understand it, but the logical concept of a firewall, something that's going to break an outbreak. And in this case, that's the zero trust type concept, being able to put, separate networks apart. And to me, that was the first time I really understood what a tabletop exercise was really about in the cybersecurity space. So that's a book I would highly recommend people take a look at if they're interested in learning more about this. Any parting thoughts?
No, I mean, I think as you're coming up with your plans for the year, when you're coming up with your different projects and which ones you're going to want to test, I think it's really important to just come up with the framework of what you want to test, who needs to be in the room, and then coming up with the actual plan on what you're going to execute on, and then coming up with, where are the gaps, and being pretty open and realistic with your team about being like, hey, these are the things we have to solve for before we try to do the next one.
Yep. Plan to plan type of thing. Love it. Cool. Well, hopefully you all enjoyed that. There's a lot in that space. We touched on a lot of the tops of the waves, but given our experience, we'd be happy to answer any questions people have. If you're looking on how to set one up, if you're looking for even some of the stuff that my day job has done, I'd be happy to connect you with that kind of information. So drop us a line, let us know what you thought about that, and any other questions you might have. But for now, we appreciate you showing up and socializing with us live from RSA. We'll be back soon. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.